might say organizations, because most of us actually do the work of philanthropy through organizations, okay? But if we're in community, it's collectivities. So that is the watu. But in order to make change, one of the things we realize, and one of the things we'll explore here, is that there are actually other levels of being that also need transformation. So the umtu, or the person, it means person in Swahili, the individual, also needs change, because we add up to a collectivity. But that idea of the deep code is that actually perhaps what also needs to shift is the utu. I use that word just actually to invoke the spirit of Mishera Mugo, the late Mishera Mugo, who just passed, a brilliant Kenyan radical intellectual who speaks a lot about this. Some people refer to it as Ubuntu. For her, she uses the word utu, which is really kind of like the ethical infrastructure that shapes both the self and the collective. So, again, you can keep that schema in mind as we talk about what does it really mean to make change through organizations, which is the tool that we have, right, in philanthropy. So we're going to do a quick poll, and as I understand, it's on the Wahova. So, so this is the question, because it was just, we can see if it works. If not, we'll just do by a show of hands. But I'm just very curious for you all to just have a quick think before we begin talking, right, about how you honestly feel about change. How do you honestly feel about change? So when you are faced with a need or request to transform a process, a system, culture, the direction of your organization, how comfortable are you? And I think, please let me know how you do it. So you go into the app, is it? Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. So if you go into notification, I might need your phone to see the app. So if you go into notifications, how many people here have Dawahova? Wait, it's not enough. We have 10% usage. Okay, so we're going to do by show of hands. Let's just be analog. That's one thing I love, by the way. I was thinking yesterday, I was like, we keep going on about the ubiquity of AI and how it's going to control us. And I just say, that's interesting. All you need to do is unplug the server. Okay, so it's on a Likert scale, right? It's on a 5-part scale. So from not comfortable at all to very, very comfortable with change. So if you want, you can even close your eyes if you want to be completely honest only to yourself, okay? So we're going to begin with very, very, very comfortable. When faced with a proposition or request to transform anything in your organization, how comfortable do you feel? So raise your hand if you feel incredibly comfortable, you love it, you're here for it. Yes, let's go. Okay. And if you feel moderately comfortable, moderately. Okay, that's a good number. If you feel, you kind of have mixed feelings. If you feel quite uncomfortable. And if you feel not comfortable at all with change.
We're not comfortable with that.
We're not comfortable with that's good. So we're actually on a moderate to high tolerance for transformation, which is great. That's the room you want to be in. Well, that's the room I want to be in. Okay, so we have a panel here. What we're going to do is just ask a range of questions, and people are going to speak from their practical experience of these, because again, we're practitioners in this room, so we want to think about the how of it, okay? So to perhaps begin over here, I'll just do name and type because of time. It's Andrew Chilinal, and he is the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, and he's also the board chair of WINGS. And he's based in Canada. Rodrigo Piponzi, who is the founder and chairman of an Instituto, how do you say it in Portuguese?
ACP.
ACP. In Brazil. Beleza, tudo bom. Okay. And then we have Jackie Asimwe from SIFSource, which is based in Uganda initially, but also is operating in South Africa and Kenya. And lastly, we have Julian Corner from the UK, from Langley Chase. So we're going to have a conversation, and we have a little bit of an opportunity perhaps for questions. We shall see how we go. All right. So listen, we're using really loaded terms here, right? They're like the big grammar of our sector: leadership, transformation, risk, failure. And so we want to give some practical flesh to what those things really mean, okay, when it comes to how we do our work. So Rodrigo, I'm interested. You are coming from the opportunity of generational wealth. You come from an industrialist family, or a family of entrepreneurs. And you have this opportunity of generational wealth. You also have this knowledge of the private sector and how it works. And you have this commitment to civil society-led change, in particular to leverage this golden egg of flexible resources. So I'm really interested to know why it is that somebody who comes from that background and from a family like you do would be interested to resource civil society in the way that you do.
Thank you, Jessica. I'll try to make a long story a short story, okay? So we have time to talk. But I need to tell this story because probably my inspiration comes exactly from my journey as a social entrepreneur, and somehow from my position within my family as a rebel, in the fact that I didn't want to follow the natural steps of working in the family business. So when I graduated from my business administration school, I decided to start my own communication studio. And for me, the game changer in this journey, when I got to have my first contact with the third sector, with a social organization in São Paulo called GRAC. GRAC is a hospital, a very popular hospital in Brazil, based in São Paulo, that works with treatment of child and infant cancer for free from all over the country. And for me, this was a game-changing and transforming experience, because not only to understand what is it like to see an organization like that can treat people from families from all over the country for free, but also to understand the challenges that they had around fundraising and around making that hospital work. I remember getting a shocking information that for each £1 that they spent at that time, only 30 cents were covered by the government, and the other 70 cents they should raise those funds, and most of those funds were to pay the common bills for the hospital, like energy, water, the employees, and everything. And then when I was already working as a social entrepreneur, I created a social business that created a very successful platform of raising micro donations in retail companies in Brazil. And I was already working with more than 100 organizations. I saw that this was a very common problem. All the organizations had the same problem, that they could not raise those funds for their daily basis expenses. And so, cut the long story to a short story, some years ago, 4 years ago, I was together with my father discussing the idea of creating an institute, a family institute, and we were in a very nice and beautiful learning experience within the family in the philanthropic sector, because they needed knowledge to understand better why should we start an institution. And we understood after that maybe for me personally this could be a very nice match, to have a family institute that could work exactly around these issues of how can we deliver those flexible funds for the organizations. And so we decided that our mission would be to support the institutional development of the social organizations in Brazil. Mm-hmm. And how should we do that? That was our first question. The first idea, okay, we should create a fund. And it's important to say that this institution, this family institution, Instituto ACP, which your accent was great, it's completely funded with family money from our own pockets. And we decided to launch our first fund, selecting 5 social organizations, and understand what is it what is it like not only to deliver those flexible funds to this organization, but what's the process between this idea? What are we going to learn together with these organizations, and what is it going to what I figured out later? It's how would the experience transform our own organization? So it's been an amazing experience to understand that, because it's been more than 14 or 15 organizations that already received funds from us, and this completely rebuilt our mission as an organization. We had recently developed our new theory of change, and understanding that we have not only we are like a provider of flexible funds, but we have the capacity of influence our peers and other institutional organizations in Brazil to also do the same, but also understand that we are an organization working with flexible funds that can articulate with other actors in the field to build new projects, new like ideas that can stimulate. Just to give one quick example, we are launching next year our first fund completely focused on supporting institutional development only for like community and organizations located on low-income neighborhoods in Brazil. And so this is like a very still uncommon conversation in Brazil, but it's something that we understand that we can push the conversation. So that's a little bit of the story, and for me, the main point is like how I could connect the experiences between third sector that I got as a social entrepreneur and private sector that I got from my family, connect those experiences to create an institute that could be run with our own money, which means that we could take much more risks, we could test and experiment much more to get where we got.
That's great. And again, it's interesting because I know that in our spaces, we always have this mantra of we need core, we need flexible, we need community resourcing. And I think sometimes what we don't acknowledge is that that call is being heard, and a lot of people are actually leaning into that request. And I think it's important because sometimes we don't always acknowledge that we move, right? And without acknowledging that we move, we're not acknowledging that we're actually transforming. So Andrew, I mean, I'm curious because you sit, in the space of community, and in the space of community, from community foundations that are also asking for a radical reimagining of all of this. So I'm interested to hear what transformation means, from your vantage point.
Yeah, first off, let me just say that I work in philanthropy, and so in my role, I work with 205 foundations in Canada that hold a significant amount of wealth, in the ballpark of $7 to $8 billion of capital. And so I have the opportunity to be with leaders and with boards. And so the perspective that I want to provide you is an insider perspective. And oftentimes I might say things that boards and leaders might not want you to know, but I'm gonna tell you anyway. This is the benefit of speaking outside of Canada. So when it comes to transformation, I think it's important to define what that means, at least what it means to me. And I use words like complete change, radical change, significant change, a market change. So this is not about incrementalism on any level. The second thing is when we talk about transformation, over the past couple of days, we talk about it in the constructs of philanthropy. And in my mind, whether it's Ubuntu or the love of humanity, I actually don't think the definition of philanthropy needs transformation. I think the institutions that represent philanthropy need transformation. And when we look at the institutions, we have to look at the governance and we have to look at the leadership. And so the honest reflection that I have is that within the institution of philanthropy, there is actually already transformational leadership, but there's also transactional leadership. So let me expand on that. Let me just give you something that I think we all understand, just so I can make the point. We're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so at the bottom of that pyramid, the very basic needs of all human are physiology needs. So that would be food, water, shelter. There's also safety needs to live in predictable and stable environments. And so when we talk about transactional leadership within philanthropic institutions, that type of leadership is what we provide to our stakeholders in the community. Right? So those that are working on the ground, the NGOs, the civil society organizations. Now at the top of Maslow's pyramid, there's the type of needs that are self-actualization needs and esteem needs. So those are needs that help us those are about realizing our potential, allowing us to feel good about ourselves, fulfilled. And we provide transformational leadership in that area as well. But who is it to? It's to the donors. It's to the wealth holders. It's to our own governance and our own leadership. And so it's inverted. We should actually be providing that transformational leadership to those that we're working with in community as well. But we've privileged certain stakeholders in that business model. So we have a psychological conundrum that we have to deal with in our philanthropic institutions. And so you would say, well, why can't we offer those higher level needs to our most important stakeholder? The perception is, and this is what nobody wants to talk about, that if we offer those needs to our most important stakeholders and communities, that somehow that's going to erode or take away from our own self-actualization. Right? So that's an important thing, and that's a perception. That's not reality. It's what we believe, but it's not true. So let me just leave the psychological paradigm for a second, and let's go to risk. When we talk about transformation, when philanthropic institutions look at transformation, it's an extremely high-risk endeavor. So in the corporate world, corporations transform their services, their business models, and their products all the time. Why do they do that? There's competition. There's a natural predator. If they don't do that, they will go out of business. People will lose their jobs. Governments, same thing. If they're not able to deliver, another government will show up. In philanthropy, what is the natural predator for a philanthropic institution? There isn't one. So there is no natural motivation to transform. And oftentimes the transformation has to come from the internal impetus. And guess what? There never is, or rarely is. Although I know one of our speakers might say there is.
I'm going to say
Few and far between.
Yeah.
So how do we incentivize boards and leaders to be transformative in their leadership? How do we do that? And that is a question that we don't have answered yet. We actually don't know how to do that. There are things that we could think about. Imagine if the philanthropic network in a country like Canada, where all those that received grants said, we're not going to take your money. Our most important stakeholder disengaged from us and said, we're not going to take your money unless you go through an intentional exercise to transform. That would be a way to do it. However, we'd have to suffer through a period of time when those basic needs are not going to be met. But these are the radical things that we have to think about, because we actually do have power to make those with wealth and wealth holders change.
Interesting. So I'm actually going to turn to Julia now because it's an interesting provocation, and perhaps it's not that it's a predator, but it's the Utu. So when the ethics demand for you to change, perhaps you need to change. So I'm curious to speak with you, Julian, about that, because it feels like that's actually what your institution did and responded to this demand to decolonize.
Right.
And to redistribute. And so I'm curious to know kind of, what that dynamic was and what it's taken.
Thank you. Yeah. I was listening to Marlene this morning, and I 100% agreed with her analysis, and then tried to relate it back to what it's like to sit inside of an institution, a self-perpetuating institution that wants to keep living as an institution, rather than just as a inheritor of wealth. And so I think possibly the answer to this is you need to create the conditions for transformation within your organization. You can't necessarily go for the transformation itself, because almost by definition with transformation you don't know what that is going to look like. And if you know what it's going to look like, why haven't you done it already? So the conditions that I would describe in my own organization are like creating a pressure cooker until eventually the valve went. Or a slightly less pleasant analogy, we ended up coughing a hairball up, like a cat. So my organization is endowed. We've been around for 60 years, and we're a social justice foundation. And we have very much in the UK pioneered a systems approach, systemic approach to systemic funding, trying to move away from funding projects and organizations to funding systems. And what we, I guess, discovered in that process is that the more we tried to be systemic, the more we were centered as the sort of glue that held all of the pieces together. And the more that we were centered, the more we got confronted with the inherent contradictions of our own model, like who makes the decisions versus who does the work, who owns the money versus who needs the money, what the money is invested in versus what it is spent on. And in the UK in particular, you know, the funding of charity versus the pursuit of justice. And so we were engaged in an action inquiry process, which I would describe as rebounding upon us, like a kind of feedback loop. And most foundations do not have feedback loops. To understand what they're being told and to act upon it. But because we engaged in action inquiry rather than just funding programs, we got more and more caught up in the dynamics of the work that we were funding. And started to realize that rather than just funding the wisdom and the work out there, what would it be like if that wisdom was actually centered in our own organization? What if we acted on the wisdom that we were resourcing out there? So we have always had this mantra of out there is in here. The pain and the opportunity and dynamics and systemic dynamics that are out there are also here in this organization. But it's very, very hard on a day-to-day basis in the claustrophobia of an institution to really to process those. But ultimately, as I say, the pressure built and built in the organization. And then it was the pandemic, Black Lives Matter, and indeed this new term of polycrisis that says, this is unsustainable. We are part of the problem. This is not our vision. This is not our money. And do we want to be gatekeepers for this money that we didn't earn, and we certainly don't own? It's in trust. Do we want to be gatekeepers for this, or do we want this to act as pathways through to a different kind of future? And so. Yeah, there wasn't some kind of lightning bolt moment, and nor was there like a cognitive X plus Y equals Z. It was a growing feeling that we were fundamentally in contradiction with ourselves. You know, that form wasn't following function, that we were enacting the structures and mindsets of a 20th century institution when we were advocating for 21st century change and transformation. And eventually it just became unsustainable.
And can you tell them what you did? Because they may not know.
Sorry?
Can you tell them what you did? Because they may not know.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, so we're closing. We're closing in 5 years, and all of our assets, in particular our capital, is moving out of the organization into community ownership, so it's owned by the grassroots networks that we have been grant funding to this date. So Lankelly Chase in 5 years will no longer exist as an institution, but instead the capital will sit in the very places that we have been moving the money to. And it's 5 years because, you know, people need time to fill the void that our institution will leave. But also, we need to support processes of reimagination and transformation so that people can understand how to relate to this wealth differently.
Interesting. Great. So we've heard a lot of, again, interesting models of looking at transformation at a meta scale, thinking about how we do it using our assets, and again, exercising leadership at these different scales that I spoke of in the ecosystem. Jackie, I'm interested because, you know, very often where our understanding of transformation gets stuck is in ourselves. We spoke about kind of this issue of, you know, we take ourselves very, very seriously. And very often we enjoy the power that position affords, be that you're in the position of having, you know, dominion over assets, or even dominion over a job title and a position in an organization. You've been really innovative in SivSource and really rethinking how you do leadership. You have this rotational CEO model, which again is fascinating. I'm curious to know, you know, what got you there in terms of thinking about reorganizing power constantly in your organization and thinking again about how you offer leadership to different people in the organization, and what it's meant for you as the original CEO.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you for that question, Jessica. So SivSource is 6 years old. We turned 6 on 1st October. This Sunday, yes. And cake. So when I started SivSource in 2017, I have a long career in civil society mostly, and or in supporting civil society from a donor perspective when I worked on that side of things. And one of the things that we realized challenges organizations often is handing over power, not just organizations, leaders. And that often when that process is not managed well, it sets back the organization and the work. And so when I started SivSource, I started to think about how do we not fall into the same challenge. Before we got to the rotational leadership, because it wasn't a thing that we thought about in the beginning, I started off with wanting all of us in the organization to understand that we are all leaders. And that just because one person held the title of CEO, that doesn't make me the ultra leader. We are all leaders, from the person at the gate to myself. And so we read a book together about leadership and about how we are all leaders, how we all have influence, how we all, whatever we manage as leaders, so that we sort of, in a sense, decentralize what we think leadership is. That was one step. The other was, I think it was a year ago or so, we had a process at one of our retreats where the facilitators asked us, if you were not your role, what are you really doing here? So, because you're not, CEO is just a title, it's not what you do. And so if you go to the SivSource website and look at the page that says our team, you will not find a job title. You'll find what we have described as our role in the organization and outward. So actually in that, I'm described as a relationship weaver, because I literally spend 90% of my time relationship weaving for and on behalf of the organization and the constellation of people that we work with. And so I think even letting go of that and understanding that I'm not married to this title, I am something else or something more, I think also helped us. And in fact, when you look at our team page again, the person in the center who is our heart, our happiness manager, our welfare person, is really who the organization is about. She ensures that we are taken care of so that we can do our work. And so Sandra proudly calls herself the heart of SivSource. And she calls us her people, so sometimes we call her our MP, Member of Parliament. And then fast forward, one of the books that we read as a collective, as the staff, was Power of Moments. I don't remember the the author. But we started also to think about how do we create moments for leading. And in one of the book conversations, one of the staff members said, and this was in COVID, we miss the times when Jackie used to travel and then somebody else led. And I'm like, what did you just say? And I don't think she didn't even say it badly, but it was just that moment of pause of, because, we weren't going anywhere, so I was forever CEOing. And so that was an interesting, I heard that and I thought, so what does that mean and how can we actually effect this? So we from her comment is how I thought about, let's try rotational leadership. Because one day, fact, I will not be there, either in this position or in this life. It is a fact. Two, that unless the organizations, and part of the challenge that we found, organizations, if you're not ready for change, you cannot be ready for change. So it was our way to practice being ready, that one day I will not be the CEO, and so how does the organization become ready? How do I? Because it's also a practice of, like you said, used to holding power. How do I also practice letting go? So this is how we do it at CivSource. I'm sure there are many models out there. So 2 years ago, we started with our first rotational CEO. That was Lillian Tamale, who heads our Civ Fund. And so she acted as CEO for 4 months. And during that time, someone from the team steps up and I step away. So I am still doing work, but the decisions, heading the senior leadership team, that is not mine. Somebody else is leading the team. The team is experiencing somebody else leading them. I am modeling that I am also following. I am accountable to them. They know where I am, what I am doing. They actually do my performance evaluation because it usually happens towards the end of the year. So it is my way also to teach that I can be led, that I can follow, and that somebody else from the team can lead. That's what we're doing for now. So we did it for 4 months, and then last year we were not able to because the person that was going to take it on had to travel, and so we let that go. But then this year we have another rotational CEO called Malcolm. But again, it is our way to practice letting go and not holding on in ways that constrict leadership and change in our organization.
Thank you. And again, I keep thinking about, feel free to clap. I keep thinking about the opening plenary because for me it was really profound. Some of the things said they were really profound and I think again deserve some meditation. But again, a shared pointer was around this question of value, right? So who or what is valued, what is considered valuable, and who gets to decide what is valuable, who is valued, but also how that value is shared, right? That was really the provocation, you know? A sacred land to some people is valuable because that is where their ancestors reside and where they go for prayer. And to other people, they just see it as grazing fields for cows to make hamburgers, right? But because they have more structural power, they get to decide that the value of the land is for grazing cattle and not for offering prayers. So ultimately, we are struggling with this question of value, right? What is valuable? What is valued? Who defines it? And how is that shared? So, I'm curious because, of course, all of this is not easy. If it was easy, we would be there already. In fact, we wouldn't be in poly-crisis. We would be in poly-joy, poly-carnival, poly-good times, right? Yeah, okay. So, but we're not. And so I'm interested to know now, really for us to think about the things that are difficult about this. And Andrew, I know you've done a lot of thinking about the Ubuntu in this equation and the whole question of mental models and how we transform the self and kind of collective selves in order to make the transformation in our communities. And I'd love you to speak about that and also what's difficult about it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I'll pick up from where you left off on the opening plenary. And I think it was Indy Johar that was talking about value. He was also talking about the deep coding that exists within our brains. And I think about that in the context of this notion of realizing our potential in philanthropy. And what does that really mean? And I'll just use an analogy. You could take a mango seed and you could plant it and cultivate it, and its potential is to become a mango tree. That's its potential. It's natural. It's what happens. Now, when you think about philanthropy, what is our potential? And that really goes back to the roots of philanthropy. And again, I want to go back to philanthropic institutions, because it's the philanthropic institutions that I think perhaps are misguided, or actually perfectly guided on its potential. We've created philanthropic institutions, and what we've put in it is capital. That becomes the most important thing. And the protection and the preservation of that capital is the most important thing, because it also protects and preserves the institution. And so what's its potential? Its potential, and Thomas Piketty writes about capital all the time. Capital begets more capital. That's well established in research. Now, is that the potential of philanthropy? It is the prescribed potential. It absolutely is. All the other things that we do are subjugated and subordinate to that potential. But this is why we need to recode, because we can't prioritize capital all the time. We actually shouldn't prioritize capital any of the time. And that requires a deep mental model shift. The challenge around that is that in philanthropy, we feel as though we get our power, our self-preservation, our status, and our feel-good moments because we can hold that capital forever. And it's a never-ending stream of feel-good moments. And how that impacts our nervous system is also well-researched and well-established. We have to think, and I'll go back to what I said earlier, we have to address the deep coding to give us a new set of incentives to then inform a new type of institution that will then have a different type of impact, and that is transformation. What I often hear is that we're trying to build new tools off the same coding that's in our brain. And all that's going to do is make what we currently do better. But that's not transform, and that's not transformation. So those are the things that we have to sort of think about in our mental models. I oftentimes say this as a joke, but I think it's more serious. Like, I think boards of directors and leaders of philanthropic institutions actually really need to see psychologists to do the work, because we could never do that on our own. We're just going to keep repeating what we've already done. It'll make us feel better, but it's actually not going to change the world.
Interesting. So, Rodrigo, I'm curious about your case, because you're dealing with layers of mental models, because you have all dynamics, because you have the dynamic of philanthropy, but also the dynamic of family. And so you're in a family foundation, and as we all know, families are quintessentially messy, I know. But you intentionally chose to have a non-family member be leading the actual work. And so I'm curious to know how you've navigated all of that. Yeah, that's something that I love to talk about, because in the beginning, for me, the tensions were like something that I was trying to avoid because of
actually because of my journey. Like when I decided that I wouldn't like be inside a family business, for me it was like very connected with the idea of not working with the family. And so when you start like a family institute, you see that all of your ideas and all of your desires of not being close to the family, they just go away, because I said, okay, here I am now trying to build something big with my father. And my father, he used to say that, like before we created the institute, that we were very lucky not to work together, because like it would never happen. And so there we were like working together. And so for me, the tensions were something that I needed to avoid. But today, like almost 5 years after the beginning of this journey, I can see that the tensions, they were really, really important for our like development as an organization. And for me, the tensions, they resonate a lot with what Andrew is saying. Like you just get the real transformation if you like go through those tensions, understand those tensions, if you get to have the difficult conversations. And somehow I could see myself in this position, like as a new generation trying to shift the ideas of an older generation, try to shift many ideas, because for me, I can list, and I will, some of the tensions, but most of those tensions, they are around those power dynamics within the families, that it's not only about the families, they are like all around. But I think they get more clear when you are working like as I did, like as an individual inside a family trying to change things. So for me, I actually made a list of some tensions, because I think it's important to give like some practical examples, but it's something that I really see today with like very good and important eyes. So for me, the first tension was always around the family participation. Like I remember the first conversation that I had with my father around like building this institute, and he said, no, for me this is legacy, this is something that I want to build, something that really resonates with the future of the country, that it's really something for my sons, for my grandsons, for all the next generations. And in his mind, this would only be possible if all the family would be present in the initiative. And of course, suddenly we realized that it was impossible to do that. I have like 2 brothers, I have cousins. Just to give like one like very practical example, we created the institute, and my father and my mother, they got divorced. So how can you deal with a family institute created within your family when two months after the creation, the formal creation of the institute, they get divorced? So it's impossible to deal like with these tensions of we need to have all the family in the organization. And somehow I could like figure out important ways to tell not only my father but my brothers and all the family, okay, there's the timing, there's the proper time for everything to happen, and this is legacy. We're looking like in the future, in the long term. It's not about today, it's about tomorrow. So I think this was like, this is still like a tension that I have to deal with, but I think it's much more accommodated today. The second one resonates what you have said, like why do we have a CEO that is not from our family? And for me, this was like a very natural step. Again, in the beginning of the organization, there was an idea from the family to have someone from the family leading the organization, but I was completely against that, because I really thought that to fight some of the power dynamics and to fight some of the prepared ideas that we had around philanthropy, we needed someone fresh. We needed someone with new ideas. And for me, this was like one of the best ideas that we had. I left things flow. I said, okay, let's try someone from the family. And I knew it wouldn't work, and it didn't work. And so that was like a very, very positive way of doing that. And today we have like an executive director, Erica, she's here filming. Hi. And we were talking yesterday how nice is it to be here together, because we are discussing like as peers. I don't feel like I am her boss. I feel we are peers discussing the future of an organization that works to promote, to support the institutional development of the civil society. So it's like a very nice conversation to have when you're driving like the future of the organization. Also, another tension that we could figure out is like how to create a governance that supports the family interests. Because, okay, everything that I said is so nice, but I need to understand the desires of the family. I need, of course, to fight some of the dynamics that I don't agree with or that I don't see that they resonate with the future, but I need to have a strong governance that can listen to them, that can act with our values, because I'm very lucky to be in a family that have very strong values. And so this was very important for us, especially to deal with some tensions like, well, one good example is like around the home office. Like my father thinks that everyone should be in the office, and it's impossible for us to have like our structure like all the time in person in the office. So when you have a strong governance, you can deal with some questions that you create a very natural flow and balance to discuss. And finally, the board. For me, like this connection between the board and the executive structure. One thing that I really started working the last years is around the board diversification. So today, I'm the only member of the family in the board. Even my father, he's not on the board anymore. He turned 70 last year, and he said, okay, I'm not like taking any more positions in the board. And so I decided that all the board, we have 4 positions today, besides mine, all the positions would be like from people, from specialists from the field, with like different perspectives and point of view. But for me, it was very important to have like this board diversification, because I really think that this is something that would really help us build the future of the organization. So, of course, not that easy, because somehow you need to understand how to balance your family within your board. But I also think this is a very important decision that we took. So those are some of the tensions that we deal with. But again, I think they are really, really important to build the future of the organization.
No, and I appreciate you saying that, because I think both you and Andrew are talking about this kind of obsession in philanthropy, for the idea of perpetuity. So we always have to be here, and you always have to make sure that whatever we do grows. Like a real commitment to certainty, a fear of failure, and a fear of death. And it just sounds like, again, you're navigating the reality that things aren't perfect, and in some respects, the world is entropic, right? The world is full of entropy. And in philanthropy, we're so concerned with controlling the world, but perhaps we can't. And so how do we lean into that? And I mean, Julian, I'm curious, because you've already spoken a bit about it, but you're in a philanthropic organization that I wouldn't say decided to die. I perhaps would say decided to compost itself. It's compost.
That's right, yeah.
And so what was the emotional process? Because you've described kind of the decisions and the reasons, but what's the emotional process around, the decision to return to the earth?
Yeah. We were asked yesterday what our first encounter with philanthropy was like. It was very interesting. I've never said this out loud before. I used to run an NGO, and I didn't know what philanthropy was, and I was invited to lunch with a very important UK philanthropist, and sat there kind of frozen, looking at this person thinking, I don't know how to relate to you, I don't know what I'm meant to do, I don't know how I'm meant to speak. After about half an hour, I went to the toilet and threw up, because I couldn't process the power dynamics. Then fast forward 7 or 8 years, I became the chief executive of this organization, and I told myself I would never forget how that felt. And then as the years go by and I start to get more and more comfortable in the role, I do start to forget, and I do start to feel, and it's back to the deep coding thing. I didn't walk around thinking I was born for this role. I'm entitled to this, I deserve this. But there was a level on which that was my coding. Like with all of the contradictions that I've described, I still felt like I was a good person to be here. And as I started to become less clear about that, it was therapeutic interventions that I needed, spiritual interventions, somatic interventions, to try and dislodge what I guess you would call white supremacy in me, that felt very much comfortable in holding this kind of position, to the detriment of others whose own leadership was being blocked by my positionality, and that has been extremely painful, and has very much affected my mental health for a while. Which, looking at it now, is like, wow, me dealing with my own entitlement affected my mental health. That's how deep the coding was in me. With my board, this was part of the creating the conditions for transformation, kind of coaxed some community leaders, activists onto my board about 3 years ago. And they were very, very reluctant to join in terms of, am I accountable to my communities? Am I accountable to this organization? And at this point, who am I in this room? These were people who themselves had traumatic experience of being on the receiving end of power dynamics and suddenly were the power themselves. And so they have needed a lot of support to hold, as they describe it, being the thing while trying to change the thing. And it takes, I think, a very special kind of person who's kind of, got a lot of wisdom inside them to really hold that position of, I'm going to steward this thing that I don't believe in order to get it to a different place while dealing with the regulators and so on. And they have continually had to process what that means for them and the journey that they are on. And in particular, there is this thing that they've been trying to get over, which is this in the UK where you call it the charitable model of trustee objectivity. Like we sit in this objective role where we make clear, neutral, objective decisions based upon the evidence that comes to us, and we keep this organization going. And so to shatter that role and say, we are going to be activist trustees. We are going to use the subjectivity that comes from our accountability to our communities, that comes from the flow of movement through us to shift this organization to where it needs to be. We're not going to sit here and pretend to a colonial model of objectivity. That's a massive amount to ask of people. And then there's my team, who have been told that the organization is ending in 5 years. And we do talk about composting, but we also talk about hospicing as well. How do we collectively come together to make sense of this change so that we can compassionately let this system die? And as I say, not a system out there, a system in here. The systems that are alive within us that need to die so that we can move on and embrace other possibilities and create pathways for people, not gatekeep. And so, it turns out that bringing the end to an institution that has embodied so many of these things, even though it has done an extremely good job of persuading itself of its own virtue and necessity, that moving on from these very harmful paradigms and structures is a fundamentally therapeutic approach, because people have to emerge the other side of it intact and ready for fulfilling lives beyond it. Otherwise, if we don't do that, we'll sabotage it. We'll make sure it doesn't happen.
And again, this is so fascinating to me, because I think anybody who's tried to encourage transformation in any way, in any context, knows how difficult it is, and as you're saying, how much resistance there is to change, even ostensibly amongst people who are asking for it. Because it's hard to shift into the unknown, and we're all trained, right, to be oppressed or to be oppressors. And so sometimes you can find that actually all sides are committed to maintaining the status quo because it's all we know, right? And so then that kind of bravery, but that also it takes doing the work. And I was thinking actually, Jackie, when you were talking about how you prepared collectively to have a rotational CEO, was actually to read and to sit and to think about it, right? To make the space so you could critically reflect, so that then you weren't just imposing a cute idea, you know what I mean, or deciding, oh, this sounds great and let's do it, but actually kind of building up the inner frameworks and the, kind of the thinking, the conceptual thinking or ethical frameworks to say this is what we want to do, and so we're kind of going to move with this experiment. Just as a final question to you, Jackie, and then I think we have like 5 minutes perhaps for questions. I'm looking over there for that sign that says, please be quiet. So, I mean, some of this change can happen in environments that allow it and enable it. But we also know that in many places in the world, there is actually a lot of pressure against philanthropy and a pressure against social justice organizing. Because it is organizing that asks questions about power, it asks questions about accountability, and there are certainly structural movements that are looking to, you know, shift policy and make conditions difficult. And I'm curious, I mean, you have managed to remain innovating in environments that, regulatory environments that actually can be a bit difficult sometimes. And I'm keen to know how you balance that question of managing risk while you're also dealing with, again, a kind of regulatory reality that's difficult. And I ask that because, like I said, all over the world, there's actually increasing pressure on progressive philanthropy. And that all these changes we're talking about are not happening in a vacuum. They're not happening in neutral space. Sometimes they're happening at a moment when movements are asking us to change, but structures are pushing us to not, or to be quiet, or to close, or to not lean into the movement demand. And so it would be interesting to just hear what your thinking is about that. How do you maintain the spirit, the flexibility and fluidity, and a kind of innovation commitment in an environment that can be sometimes quite brittle?
I think we're still trying. And so I'm not even sure that I have an exact answer to your question, but these are the two thoughts that came up. That part of what we did also as CivSource was to decide what our values are, and it's very interesting that the acronym for our values is DARE. Dignity, audacity, reliability, and equity. And so oftentimes when we sit together at a table as the staff members, we're always asking ourselves whether we are daring. And I think keeping that front and center means that in order to dare, you have to continue to innovate, to hide in plain sight, to shape shift, and it can be exhausting also, sometimes frightening, because you'd like to be able to ride a steady ship for a while, but the context we are in Uganda and in many of our countries, you can't do that. And so I think leaning on our values helps us to keep doing that and allowing ourselves to fail, because also when you're daring, you might make a mistake, you might fail, you might slip, but you get back up and say, what else can we dare to do? So there's that. I think the other thing is that from the onset, one of the books that we read together as a collective was Strategies for Building an Organization with a Soul, by our good friend Hope Chigudu and her niece Rudo Chigudu. So, because I think where you come from to do that daring, to do that innovating, is also critically important. And so building an organization with a soul for us means, and we summarized it in our soul song, which is voice and dignity, is to say, even as we dare, even as we shapeshift, even as we create and innovate, how do we not lose dignity and voice? Because then we will have extinguished ourselves. We will have died, we will have killed ourselves. So I think that for me, leaning on our values and leaning on what the core of our soul is in a sometimes soulless world or space.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm just looking at the organizers. Should we? I think we're able to have a question or so, not so? Oh, we need to finish? Okay. And with that, we shall compost ourselves. Okay, well listen, I hope you've enjoyed. Honestly, as someone who ended up in philanthropy, I'm always like surprised. I've been here like 15 years. I'm like, how did that happen? I think it's very important. I hope you have felt nourished. or challenged or wondering with some of the interventions that we've had here today. But I just want to thank you all for sharing. I think that there's a texture to our work that we often don't get the chance to explore, because so much of what we do is to justify, you know, why we have this strategy, or justify why we're doing that thing, or, you know, try to quantify the impact. But you see, like anything, if you're not well, anything you create won't be well either. And so I do think that it's critical that we give ourselves moments like this to actually think through together, hear from each other, and work out what is the utu, right? What is the ethical ground? What is the river? What are we drinking? Yeah? What, are we drinking fresh water? Right? How are we managing what we do so that whatever we're offering to the world, right, is something that will be nourishing? So please do join me in thanking the people on the stage, and also, you know, again, to keep carrying all of these conversations through as we discuss in the next day and a half that we have together.
Thank you very much, Jessica.